going to coast through this interview since my year has been made. Let's start out, though. A remarkable book. You had wanted to write your autobiography when you were a young man.
That's right.
You waited till you were 67. You're a procrastinator by nature, right?
Yeah, when I was 20, I realized that, growing up with my dad, who was a saxophone player in a dance band, a kind of Glenn Miller-style dance band. It was an English Air Force band. From my earliest memories were being on the band bus and I was just saying to one of your girls here, whenever I get into a show business situation, whether it's TV or radio or backstage, I feel comfortable because I was brought up in that world. When I was about 20, I realized that I'd deposed my father. The guitar had taken over from the saxophone. But more than that, the kind of song that I was writing had deposed all of the music that had gone before. The kind of songs that were being written in the early 60s were kind of making the songs that had gone before look as though the function had changed.
Right.
We needed a different kind of music. So I wanted to write that book, and in a sense, that's why this book is here. It's bigger and longer than it would have been back then because I've tried to bring it up to the present day, but which has been tricky. But I've done it.
It was a fascinating time that you grew up in, obviously post-war England, and you always heard, whether it's you or whether it was Lennon McCartney, always talking about how there was this big shadow from those who won the war. And here you come along, and the Beatles, the Kinks, the Rolling Stones as well come along and change everything. Not only change music, but change culture. What a remarkable time looking back at 64 when you broke.
We were responding to the changes that had happened, which were, of course, I didn't discover those changes, they just happened. What's interesting is the fact that among young Americans, it was clear that they felt the same thing, that something had changed after the war. It's kind of obvious. It was the nuclear bomb that changed everything. It meant that we could never get the dignity that our parents and our grandparents had got by being given a gun and being told to go and kill the enemy. That was in the past. Mm-hmm. And so our function and our dignity was going to have to come from somewhere else. So I've always used the word disenfranchisement. As young men, we were happy, we were free, we were safe. I think we felt safe. But we knew that our parents and grandparents had been through some terrible times. 100,000 women were raped in Hungary when it was deserted. Vienna went through the most incredible crisis after the war. In the First World War, 15 million young men died. These were things that we could never ever rise to in a silly pop song. So my dad's music was about how do we rebuild, how do we fall in love again after the war, how do we get things back. Our music was about what can we ever do that will match that?
Right.
And so, in a sense, the Beatles, the Stones, and the Who were just responding to a whole group of young people who wanted music. We wanted to give it to them. Yeah. But what they wanted to say was, And a lot of the time, they couldn't put it into words.
Why did it get out of the shadow? There's that great line in A Hard Day's Night where the guy says to John Lennon, "I fought the war for the likes of you," and John Lennon said, "I bet you're sorry you won." That takes you to 64. So let's talk about the Who. Let's start in talking about the Who. So 1964, you get your big break. I Can't Explain. You said you were listening to the Kinks and trying to get that big sound. So the song hits. You're on your way. And Roger Daltrey immediately tells you the song is crap. I'm never going to do it. And later in the book, at the end of the book, you've got Roger going to you going, isn't this tour great? You're like, take it or leave it. You guys always seem to love to torture each other. I mean, it's
I don't know that
it's a fascinating relationship.
No, we're closer now than we've ever been, but now I realise actually that we probably always were. It's the neighbourhood. We're from the neighbourhood. We came from a neighbourhood, and we were at polar opposites of the neighbourhood, but we were certainly from the same neighbourhood. Roger has often said, "Oh, Pete portrays himself as working class, but he's not really working class." The kids that I I was in class with at school were working class kids. You know, some of them were sleeping 10 to a room.
Right.
You know, I knew what it was like, and these were my customers as a songwriter. Yeah. I wanted to reach them and touch their hearts, but Roger always felt that he didn't need to go through that process because he was one of them.
Right.
So all I had to do was to get a song for him that he liked, and then I realized I was one step closer to pleasing the audience.
Right.
Because he was a filter. You know, and we did argue a lot in the early days, but never in the way that we portrayed.
Wow.
We knew it was good press.
One step closer. He was also, Roger was the one that got all the girls.
Yeah.
It's just, you gotta hate those guys. You just gotta hate those guys. It's just too easy for them. Just like you, Sam,
it's
right?
Why I Hate Barnacle, right? What do you think of music today? I mean, are there any bands that you like? Do you think the record industry is doing? I mean, economically, it's totally different than when you were.
I did a lecture in the UK about inspired by a guy on the BBC called John Peel. Yeah. The John Peel lecture, I did the first one, and I attacked Apple. Apple are big enough to take it, so I attacked Apple. Not because they're bad people, but because they've changed the rules. In fact, you know, without Apple software and without Apple equipment, I couldn't do my job today. I love it. It's revolutionized my life. But I do think the difference between people that take money, like Amazon and Apple and Spotify and various other organizations, is they don't do what those evil record companies used to do, which is give you money. They don't give
the
you
artist.
Money. That's right.
Yeah.
They just take it from you. They just take a piece. They're bankers. They're like agents. They don't do anything for you. They put your music up there, and iTunes is a most extraordinary, fabulous piece of software. I know there are a lot of people now saying that the quality isn't good enough, but works for me. I'm half deaf anyway. But you know, the important thing is that the record companies, you know, some of them were very corrupt, and some of them are battling now to resist paying payments for electronic digital downloading. But I just wish Apple would put maybe just 1% of this huge, massive profits they're making at the moment into nurturing artists, new young artists that need a bus, that need a van, that need a guitar, that need a laptop, that need a DJ kit, something. You know, what would it cost them to do that? You know, I do that stuff. I help young musicians, and why shouldn't they? Anyway, that's my pitch. So the record companies were not great, but I think where we are now is that we're in a place where there's a lot of music around which is so fabulous, but I'm just wondering, everybody has to do it on their own. You know, you have to have a day job.
Yeah. So let's, I want to go through some highlights and some lowlights of The Who. And let's start with, because we've got a lot of music fans here that watch the show. Let's start with My Generation. I mean, that was a big breakthrough moment. And there's, of course, the legendary story of everybody packing when you went on the Smothers Brothers show, which was in the Kids Are All Right documentary. At the end of the song, Keith Moon almost blew himself up. Talk about that song. Talk about how it was a breakthrough moment.
Well, the song was a talking blues. I've been listening to a lot of Bob Dylan, and I'd written this talking blues, you know, like a kind of style of Mose Allison, or like a folk song, you know, like a Woody Guthrie folk song. You know, people try to put us down, and I'm talking about my generation, you know. And Chris Stamp, who was one of our managers, came to see it and said, you know, this could be great. Beef it up. And I said, you know, it's just a little folk ditty. He said, no, beef it up. So I beefed it up, and then I beefed it up again. And I realized that actually what it spoke of was what I mentioned earlier on, this cusp between the world of my dad's music and the world of our music. It was generational. The music was reflecting a generational change in society, that there was a whole group of people from 1959 onwards who felt disenfranchised. And the music was about, that song was about that, really. And it was about, when I sing I Hope I Die Before I Get Old, it doesn't mean I don't want to be an old man. It meant I don't want to live the way you live. I don't want to live the way you old people live. I don't want to live pursuing valediction and military might and in colonialism and imperialism, because the cost is too high.
You had a string of hits: Magic Bus, Substitute, The Kids Are All Right, and something I didn't know until I read the book, Paul McCartney's favorite Who song.
Happy Jack.
Happy Jack.
Yeah.
Who would have ever guessed that?
No.
And which you
Maybe
say,
it's the only one he liked.
Which you say you got from, actually, Eleanor Rigby. Talk
That's
about
right.
that.
Yeah, I loved Eleanor Rigby. I mean, of course, the music, the arrangement was by George Martin, his producer, and written on a chart. Mm-hmm. And that's interesting, because the idea that in my dad's era the music was different to my era, the function of it was different, but also they wrote it out.
Yeah.
You know, the arrangements, and we didn't. We used tape machines. You know, Les Paul, the famous guitarist here, invented this multi-track tape machine, and that was our notation.
Yeah.
And now we use computers. Yeah. And funnily enough, the computer brings you to a place where you're almost writing it out again. You can be much more organized. When
you did Tommy, you were blasted by critics as being pretentious and self-involved. And what was so ironic was I heard John Lennon, after he put Plastic Ono Band out, bitterly complain, well, nobody attacked Pete Townshend when he did Tommy, but you actually were. But what they called pretentious was actually audacious. Nobody had ever done anything like this before. Did you know, as you were going through this, that you were bending rock history?
Yeah, I knew that we would get attacked as well. But it was a last ditch, really. I think that the Who were we hadn't broken America. We'd had a couple of hits here. We'd done a couple of little tours, but I knew that we weren't going to break it unless we did something really audacious. I love that word rather than pretentious. That's audacious, courageous, impudent. Yeah. But the idea that you could... It was the word opera, I think. But then, we had these fantastic reviews.
And your next album was the first time the Who sort of stopped. And you got Glenn Johns, and for the first time you had somebody that really focused on the sound. Who's Next? Just extraordinary masterpiece. But you didn't like the title. You didn't like the album cover, which I always thought was like one of the great rock album covers.
You like a picture of a bunch of guys pissing, excuse me. Pissing up against an obelisk. I mean, what's the symbolism? Here's a lump of concrete. We're wild guys. We pee up against an obelisk.
Sort of 2001 Space Odyssey. I thought it was good. But anyway, Who's Next? You didn't like the title. You didn't like the album cover. And all the people you respected came to you and said, it's amazing.
Yeah, that's right. I had a much bigger idea. A much bigger idea. In my head, I'd invented the internet, and I wanted to do this music. This is years before anybody else had even thought of it. I'd invented the internet, and I wanted to do a story about the coming of the internet. And so I used to pitch this. I'd say there'll be this big grid all over the world, and we'll all be connected up, and we'll all share ideas, but it will lead to difficulties, and problems, and, and barons will take it over. And there was this one day where Roger said, Pete, it's a great idea, but, if we do a movie, we won't be able to get enough wire. That's what he said.
Before we go, we've got to talk, obviously, about two friends of yours, two bandmates that passed away, of course. Keith Moon, I think it was 78, 79, 78, who was he was the epitome of a rock and roll drummer in every way. And then something I didn't realize until I read this book, John Entwistle. I didn't realize you guys were such close friends, and I didn't realize how much you loved him, how much you depended on him, and how he sounded like you see these rock stars and you read about, but he sounded like he was an incredible, solid friend.
Yeah, he was. Yeah. He was. Keith was in his way, but Keith was always trying to do a comedy routine.
Right.
And he was always trying to come up with something that would make you laugh. And I used to be happy to be his fall guy. But when he died, when Keith died, the sad thing is that he was just getting well. He was just managing to stop drinking and stop using drug cocktails. He was never into big narcotics, but he would do this thing of, mixing a glass of Remy Martin with brandy with whatever anybody gave him in a cup. One day it happened to be elephant tranquilizers, and we were about to do a show. He was mischievous with himself and careless.
Yeah. Got you jumping off of balconies.
That's right. Yeah, once I was following him down a Holiday Inn terrace, and he suddenly flipped and jumped into the swimming pool, and I thought, I'll do the same thing, and of course I hadn't realised he'd worked it out. He used to plan this. Once he jumped out of a window. He once jumped out of a window of an apartment. He had a couple of friends waiting to go to a club with him. He jumped out of the window, and when they looked out, he was lying in a dumpster which he'd had put in place, filled with mattresses.
Oh my
so
God.
He was trying to give people heart attack. Whenever Roger and I stand on a stage, we kind of look here, we look there, and we miss them so terribly.